Hey there! This is going to be another one of those videos where I ramble. I'm not going to review a pen or an ink or paper, I'm just going to ramble, I'm going to talk, I'm going to answer a question that I receive at least once a month, be it on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever media you can use to follow me. I get this question at least monthly. So we're going to talk about it now, and to get an idea of what this question exactly is all about, I asked my viewer Mill Cuckfield to ask the question. Hi, I'm Mill Cuckfield. I'm a big fan of your videos. I always play with my pen while I watch them. I was wondering, what's the smoothest nib ever made? Yes, so what is the smoothest nib ever made? I get that question a lot, and the reason is that I think a lot of people, especially when they start out in the fountain pen world, want to buy the one pen that gives them the smoothest writing experience ever made. But even among some more experienced or seasoned fountain pen collectors, I get the question, what is the smoothest nib ever? Here is the answer. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. It was never made. There is no such thing. There is no smoothest nib ever made. It doesn't exist. It's the same as asking, what is the best car ever made, the best motorcycle, the best chef's knife, the best handgun, whatever you have, there is no such thing as the best. For example, a Formula 1 racing car is an excellent car when you need to be very fast. However, I would not really want to do groceries in that. And if I would live in a big city where there is very little parking space, I do not necessarily want to drive a Hummer, even though that is a very robust car. So think about nibs and pens and filling systems and inks and paper in those terms. There is no one best option. There are many options, but all those options form tools. Tools you put in a toolbox. And you use the right tool for the right job. Of course, you can use a screwdriver to hit a nail in the wall by just hammering at it with the back end. Of course you can. Of course you can use a hammer to drive a screw in a plank of wood. Just knock at that bastard and it's going to go in. But the thing is, that's not what they were meant for. Alright? Some nibs are very smooth, and some of them are not. That's the way it is. Now, what I want to tell you about a little bit, I want to give you some thoughts on how I assess these things. Nib smoothness, of course there are nibs that are smoother than others. Sure, I've used some cheap nibs that outperform some more expensive nibs in smoothness. And I've also used some expensive nibs that outperform pretty much all other nibs I've ever used. But that doesn't mean they're the smoothest ever. Unfortunately, there is no objective scale, as far as I know, to measure nib smoothness. You cannot say, well, that's a 17 smooth on nib, but that's a 19.5 smooth on nib, so that one is smoother. The smooth on scale does not exist. What you have to be aware of is that nib smoothness is affected by many factors. First of all, of course, there is the grind of the nib. How is it polished? If it's an extra fine nib, it's likely to be less smooth than a double broad nib. The reason being that a double broad nib has more tipping material, more material to be polished, and therefore it will give a smoother feel. However, that comes at a cost. Many nib manufacturers these days over-polish their nibs, and you notice that especially in the broader ones, and you get something called baby's bottom syndrome. I have a separate video on that if you don't know what that is. In brief, that will just lead to skips and hard starts. Even though the nib, when it writes, will be super smooth, that's one of the costs. And there are also broad nibs that are perfectly fine, just to be sure. Okay, a second factor that affects nib smoothness is the ink that you use. If you use a super dry, fast drying ink, then in my experience, typically the writing experience will be a little less smooth than when you use a very wet ink. And that's very simple because a wetter ink will lubricate your nib more, and then it will be wetter as it glides across the paper, and that lubrication gives the impression that the nib is smoother. That doesn't have to do anything with smoothness, it's just a lubrication factor of a wetter ink as opposed to a drier ink. If you've ever sharpened a knife, then you probably know what I mean. If you run it over an oiled or watered up stone, wetting stone, it's much smoother than when you run it on the stone that's dry. Okay, and that goes for a lot of things. Often it's more easy when things are well lubricated. Now, another factor that's very important is the type of paper that you use. If you use a paper like this, Clairefontaine Triomphe, that is a highly smooth paper, and that gives you no resistance whatsoever. It's a little bit like writing on glass. So if you use that, your nib will feel smoother. However, if you use another paper, also French, Verger de France by G. Lalo, this is laid paper. And what that means, very difficult to show you, and I don't think my camera is really going to pick this up. No, it's very difficult to show you that because it's just one big patch. Can't really focus on that. Laid paper means that there are these very fine lines in the paper, ribs, and you can hear them. Now, if you have paper like this, no matter how smooth your nib is, it's going to get snagged a little bit on those horizontal lines. And the problem with that is that it may give you the impression that your nib is less smooth. In fact, it can be the smoothest nib in the world, but it's just feeling the feedback from the paper because of the paper shape. And that's all there's to it. So as far as I'm concerned, you have the actual grind of the nib, which is going to decide how smooth it feels, and you can make an extra fine nib right a bit smoother if you smooth it out a bit, but even so, that's always going to be more difficult to make very smooth, and will always give a bit more feedback than a broader nib, in my experience. Secondly, there is ink. The ink factor that you use is very important. A wetter ink will probably give more lubrication and therefore a more smooth writing experience. And thirdly, there is the paper type. Paper is really important too because it decides how much feedback you get. The rougher the paper, the more you feel. And it doesn't even have to be high-end paper like this. If you use cheap copier paper that's usually very absorbent, it will suck the ink out of your pen. That can give you the impression your nib is a bit less smooth too. Okay, the final factor that I would like to mention is you. You as a user. The way you hold the pen, angle it, position it on the paper, is also going to decide how smooth the pen is. If you rotate your pen a lot as you write, sort of rotate it into the paper, you may need to use an oblique nib. If you don't rotate your pen at all, you may be well off with a regular round nib. If you want line variation, you may want to go for an italic nib, but a true italic nib has sharp corners and that can dig into the paper. That may give you the impression that the nib is not smooth, while in fact it may be a super smooth nib. So that's there. Grind, ink, paper, user. That decides how smooth the nib is. And apart from that, it's highly subjective. And I can tell you, if I have two pens and you ask me, is A smoother than B, then typically I can say it is subjective because it is, but for me, A is smoother. For example, my Pelikan M1000 is one of the smoothest nibs I own. It has a double broad nib. It is fantastic, but other people may disagree. Maybe they have received a double broad that happened to have some factory issues, time misalignment, etc. They may say, how can you say that? It's one of the most terrible nibs I've ever used. That's another factor, user experience. I don't mean experience level as in are you a fountain pen expert or a novice, but you may just have gotten a lemon, so to speak, which is a pity too, but that also affects your experience with a nib. So, in mentioning all these factors, that's how to think about it, okay? Your nibs are tools. You want line variation, get an italic. But, if it's a true italic, sharp corners may dig into the paper, and that can give the impression of being less smooth. If you have super fine handwriting, get an extra fine, but be aware that's going to give you feedback. It's the way it is, right? So you have a toolbox. You can put various pens in there. They don't have to be expensive pens. I'm not saying everybody needs to buy high-end limited editions to get smoothness, because as I said, some pens are very smooth. Here I have a Pelikan Pelicano old model smooth nib, and that's definitely not an expensive pen. Okay, so adjust the tool to the job. That's all. So I hope this was useful, and I'll gladly see you later. Bye bye.